The last thing I remember before the world folded in on itself was the sound of my own name, screamed by a voice I didn't recognize as my own. Metal shrieking against metal, glass turning to rain, my hands still gripping a steering wheel that no longer connected to anything. And then silence so complete I thought I had already died. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because everything I'm about to tell you happened after that moment, not before it. I'm starting where it hurt the most, because that's where the truth of my marriage finally showed itself, on a rain-soaked highway, at 11 minutes past 9 on a Tuesday night, when I was hanging between this world and the next, and the man who promised to love me until death made a phone call that told me exactly what I was worth to him. I could hear rain still falling on the crumpled hood of my car, a strange, almost gentle sound against the chaos around it. Sirens approaching from somewhere far off, red and blue light bleeding through my cracked windshield in broken fragments. Someone was calling my name over and over, asking me to stay with them, and I remember thinking, in that detached, floating way your mind works when your body decides it can no longer be trusted, that I didn't know the voice, and yet it sounded more concerned about me than any voice I could remember hearing in years. A paramedic pressed her fingers to my neck and shouted numbers I didn't understand. Someone cut my seatbelt away with a small black tool. I remember tasting copper. I remember the strange, distant thought that I hadn't finished the laundry, as if my brain refused to accept that home might not be where I was going. Somewhere in that chaos, a phone rang. My phone, thrown from my purse onto the wet asphalt, cracked screen glowing. A stranger picked it up. He would later tell me the caller ID said Marcus. And, because I couldn't speak for myself, this stranger, this good, decent man whose name I did not yet know, answered it for me. He told my husband there had been a serious accident, that I was unconscious, that there was significant blood loss, that the ambulance was rushing me to St. Vincent's, that he needed to come immediately. And my husband Marcus, the man I had loved for 11 years, the man whose ring I wore, whose name I had taken, whose dinner I had made every single night for over a decade, said 6 words that the stranger would repeat to me weeks later, with his voice shaking in disbelief. Call us if she dies. Not I'm on my way. Not is she going to be okay. Just those 6 words, delivered with the mild irritation of a man being told his dry cleaning would be a day late, and then the line went dead, because Marcus had hung up. If you're watching this, type your name and the city you're watching from in the comments below, because you're going to want to remember you were here at the very beginning, before I became something my husband never saw coming. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why what happened to Marcus was not revenge. It was simply the truth, arriving late, but arriving in full. I need to take you backward now, because humiliation like mine doesn't happen in one moment. It happens in 1,000 small moments you convince yourself don't count, until one day you're lying on a hospital gurney and a stranger is holding your hand because your own husband wouldn't. I met Marcus when I was 26, working reception at a mid-sized architecture firm. He came in wearing a gray suit that fit him like it had been poured onto him, carrying a portfolio of numbers instead of drawings, because Marcus wasn't an architect. He was the finance director brought in to restructure the firm. He asked my name. He came back the next day and asked me to coffee. And because I was lonely in a new city and desperately wanted someone to choose me, I said yes. For the first 2 years, Marcus was everything. He remembered how I liked my coffee. He told me I was the smartest woman he'd ever met, and I believed him, because nobody had ever said it to me like that before. My own father left when I was 9. My mother worked 2 jobs and rarely had energy left to tell me I mattered. So when Marcus looked at me like I was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life, I didn't just fall in love with him. I attached myself to him the way a drowning person attaches to anything that floats. We married when I was 29. Small wedding, a borrowed dress, because Marcus said big weddings were a waste of money we could invest instead. And I agreed, because agreeing with Marcus had already become a reflex. The first sign came 6 months in, so small I nearly missed it. I was offered a promotion, a real one, 15% raise, my own small team. I came home glowing. And Marcus listened with his arms crossed and a tight smile. "That's a lot of hours for not that much money," he said. "Doesn't really make sense for our life." Our life. Not my career. Our life. Which apparently required me to stay small so his life could stay comfortable. I turned the promotion down the next morning. That was the pattern for years. Every ambition gently talked out of me. Every dollar funneled into a joint account Marcus controlled entirely. Because he was better with numbers. Wasn't that convenient, considering he was the one who made sure I never learned otherwise? I stopped seeing friends. Because Marcus always had a reason our evenings were better spent alone. And wasn't that romantic, he'd say, when really it was a slow, deliberate erosion of every person who might have looked at my life and asked if I was okay. Have you ever apologized for things that weren't your fault, just to keep the peace? Have you measured your worth by how little trouble you caused someone else? If you're nodding, I need you to hear this wasn't love. Love does not require you to disappear in order to be safe. If any of this feels familiar, comment below where you're watching from, because by the end, you're going to see exactly what happens to people who mistake control for love. Marcus's mother, Diane, never liked me, and Marcus never once defended me. At every family dinner, she'd mention how her son could have done better, how it was such a shame he'd settled for a receptionist's daughter. Marcus would actually laugh along at his own mother insulting his wife at his own table. There was a Thanksgiving, maybe 6 years in, when Diane spent the whole meal praising a friend's daughter, who'd really made something of herself, looking directly at me while she said it, over a table I'd spent 2 days preparing. I excused myself to the kitchen, and Marcus's sister followed me in, not to comfort me, but to ask whether I'd ever thought about doing something with my time. Marcus found me at the sink 20 minutes later. He didn't ask if I was okay. He asked if the coffee was ready, because his father wanted some, and I carried it out to a room full of people who just agreed I wasn't enough. And he never once said, "My wife is more than enough." There was our third anniversary too. I'd planned a weekend at a lake house 2 hours out, paid for, out of my dwindling allowance, imagining evenings walking by the water, remembering why we'd chosen each other. Marcus canceled the morning we were supposed to leave, a client dinner, unmovable. He said. I drove out alone anyway, because I'd already paid for it, and sat on that porch by myself for 2 days watching couples pass on the trail below. When I got home, he asked, almost as an afterthought, how the trip had been. I said, fine. He didn't ask a single follow-up question. A marriage without attention isn't a mature marriage, it's a lonely one dressed up in nicer language, so you'll stop asking for what you need. If you've spent an anniversary alone telling yourself it was fine, it wasn't. It was a warning, and warnings deserve to be heard the first time, not the 10th, not 8 years later on a hospital gurney. Try harder. That phrase followed me through my entire marriage. Try harder to be likable. Try harder to be thin. Because Marcus had opinions about my weight, he called concern for my health. Try harder to be interesting at his work dinners, where he'd introduce me as my wife without my name attached, like furniture he'd acquired. There was another night I still think about. A few weeks before that particular Thanksgiving, when Marcus's sister Lauren called, just to ask, in that tone that pretends at concern while landing like an accusation, whether I'd thought about doing something with my life now that Marcus was doing so well. I didn't have the language then to say what I understand now, that disappearing well enough, long enough, starts to look from the outside like a choice, when really it's a slow erasure performed at someone else's request. There was a dinner, 4 years in, that I still think about. Marcus invited his boss and coworkers. I spent 2 days cooking and cleaning. Partway through, a coworker named Vanessa made a joke, and the whole table laughed, and Marcus looked at her the way he used to look at me. I noticed it. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself that for almost 2 more years. There were late nights that stretched later. Business trips that multiplied. A phone Marcus began keeping face down everywhere, a habit he'd never had before. When I asked gently, he told me I was being paranoid, that if I trusted him even a little I wouldn't interrogate him like this. So I stopped asking. I told myself that was maturity. I know now it was just fear in nicer language. By 37, I'd been married 8 years and had almost entirely disappeared. No job, no real money of my own. Just an allowance Marcus transferred monthly, like I was a teenager. Most of my old friends were gone. My mother had died 2 years earlier, and Marcus had complained about how much time I was taking off to grieve. I started having chest pains that year. Nothing dramatic, just a tightness that came and went. Usually after Marcus said something cutting, and then went to bed, like nothing happened. I never went to the doctor about it. I told myself it was stress. The same vocabulary every woman surviving her own life learns to speak fluently. Looking back, my body had been warning me for months before the crash. 6 weeks earlier, I woke at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, certain something was wrong, though I couldn't say what. Marcus slept undisturbed beside me. I finally saw my doctor, alone, without telling him. She found nothing structurally wrong, asked gently if I felt safe at home. I said everything was fine. She prescribed blood pressure medication almost as an afterthought. The same medication I was driving to refill, in secret, the night of the crash. I went to that doctor's appointment alone, drove there myself, sat in the waiting room rehearsing how to describe symptoms I'd spent years convincing myself didn't matter enough to mention. When she asked if I felt safe at home, I answered too quickly, the way you do when the truth is too large to say out loud in a room with fluorescent lighting, and 8 more minutes on the clock. I've thought about that appointment many times since, wondering what might have been different if I'd let myself answer honestly right then. Months before the highway forced the truth out of me a much harder way. Then came the accident. That Tuesday started ordinarily. I'd done the shopping, picked up Marcus's dry cleaning, started his favorite roast for dinner. Around 8:30 he called to say he was working late. Don't wait up. He'd grab something at the office. I ate alone, and on a whim, decided to drive to the 24-hour pharmacy for that refill. It was raining hard. A truck coming the opposite direction hydroplaned across the center line with no warning, headlights swinging wildly, and then nothing but sound and impact and a silence more total than anything I'd ever known. I don't remember the ambulance ride. I don't remember much of anything until I awoke 2 days later, with tubes in both arms, a machine beeping steadily, and a face I didn't recognize sitting in the chair by the window. There you are, he said softly. I was starting to think you'd sleep through the whole week. His name was Daniel. He'd been driving behind me, seen the whole thing, pulled over, called it in, held pressure on a scalp wound with his own jacket until the paramedics arrived. He'd found my phone still ringing on the ground and answered it, thinking it might be someone who needed to know. Was it my husband? I asked, though some cold, quiet part of me already knew. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Yeah, he said. It was. What did he say? I watched him decide whether to protect me from it, and settle, reluctantly, on honesty. He said to call him if you died. Imagine hearing that with stitches in your scalp and a fractured collarbone. Imagine the particular pain that has nothing to do with your body at all. Humiliation like that doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It arrives quietly, in 6 words, from a man who once told you that you were the smartest woman he'd ever met. And it sits in your chest like a stone, unless you decide, right there, that you won't carry it. I didn't cry right away. I just lay there and thought, clearly, for the first time in almost a decade, I have been alone this entire marriage. I just didn't have proof until now. Marcus arrived nearly 6 hours later, still in his work clothes, smelling faintly of cologne I didn't recognize, holding grocery store flowers. He kissed my forehead like nothing had happened. You scared me, he said. Did I? I said, because from what I understand, you told a stranger to call you if I died. His face flickered, then went cold. I was in the middle of something important. I didn't have full information. I was going to call back. You hung up on a paramedic while I was bleeding on the highway. You're being dramatic, Marcus said. The phrase that had always worked before. This time, lying broken and clearer than I'd been in years. It didn't land the same way. If you've made it this far and you're feeling something right now, hit subscribe, because you're about to watch a woman go from someone who apologized for existing to someone who took her whole life back, piece by piece. Comment your name and city below. The next part is where the truth about Marcus and a woman named Vanessa comes fully into the light. I was in the hospital 11 days. Marcus visited 4 times, always brief, always checking his watch, managing to make his presence feel like a favor. rather than the bare minimum a husband owes his injured wife. Daniel visited 3 times, each with quiet, unhurried kindness. A worn paperback about a woman who rebuilds a lighthouse, a coffee from the good place instead of the terrible cafeteria stuff. No expectations attached to any of it. We talked for an hour once about nothing important. The weather, a bad sandwich, a childhood dog, and I remember being startled by how much I'd forgotten what easy, ordinary conversation felt like. On his second visit, he mentioned, almost as an aside, that he worked in corporate compliance, doing forensic audits for companies that suspected internal fraud. I didn't think much of it then. 3 weeks after I got home, still in a shoulder brace, I found a hotel receipt in Marcus's jacket pocket, dated the exact night of my accident, time-stamped 9:42 p.m., the same night he'd told me he was working late at the office. I stood there a long time, feeling something go very still and very cold. Not devastated, just certain, the way a puzzle finally clicks into a shape you always suspected. I started keeping a small notebook hidden inside an old cookbook Marcus would never open, writing down dates, amounts, small inconsistencies I'd trained myself for years to ignore. Nights he said he was at the office, but his car's mileage didn't match a simple round trip downtown. A restaurant charge across town on a night he'd claimed he barely had time to eat. A $4,000 withdrawal from an account he'd told me he'd closed for simplicity, a word he loved whenever he wanted me to stop asking questions. None of it made sense alone. Together, it painted the outline of a second life, running parallel to the one I thought we shared. I started paying closer attention. I found a second phone in his car console, unlocked one morning while he showered, messages to Vanessa, going back 3 years. References to trips I'd been told were solo business travel, references to an apartment across town, paid for from an account I'd never known existed. I called Daniel. I think my husband has been stealing money, I told him. Not just cheating, actually taking money. I found accounts, transfers, a lease, and none of it matches our finances. A long pause. What's the name of the company Marcus works for? I told him. Another pause. I need you to send me everything you found. Don't confront him yet. It turned out Daniel's firm had been quietly retained by Marcus's own company to investigate irregularities in a discretionary vendor fund he controlled. Nearly $300,000 bled out over 4 years through payments to shell vendors that didn't exist. Daniel hadn't known, when he pulled over on that overpass, that the man who told a paramedic to call him if his wife died was the same man his firm had been quietly building a case against for months. I felt sick before I felt anything like triumph. An old shame tried convincing me this was somehow my fault, that a better wife would have caught it sooner. It took weeks of therapy to understand the shame belonged entirely to Marcus. A person who builds his whole life on deception doesn't get to make his victims feel foolish for trusting him. I met with a lawyer, Priya, sharp and no nonsense, who specialized in divorces involving hidden assets. I brought her everything, the receipt, the phone records, the shell vendor documents. Daniel's firm had since formally reported. He's going to offer you a small settlement and expect gratitude, she told me. We're not doing that. We filed on a Thursday. Marcus tried charm first, told me Vanessa meant nothing, that we could work through this. When I told him calmly that I already knew about the shell vendors, that his own company's compliance team had a 4-year paper trail, the charm dropped off his face like a mask that had stopped being useful. You have no idea what you're doing, he said. And underneath the anger, for the first time in 11 years, I heard real fear. The company terminated him within 2 weeks. Restitution followed, then criminal referrals, eventually 3 counts of wire fraud. Vanessa left within a month of the story breaking, which told me everything about what their relationship had actually been built on. Diane stopped taking his calls the moment the story made the local business paper. The deposition process alone took nearly 4 months. I sat across a long conference table from Marcus's tired-looking attorney, watching him go visibly pale as Priya slid across invoices for consulting services from companies with no employees, no offices, no actual registration beyond a mailbox rented under a name almost, but not quite, his own. There was a pattern spanning nearly 4 years. A man who'd built an entire second existence out of money that was never his, hidden behind the same calm confidence he'd once used to convince a 26-year-old receptionist she was the smartest woman he'd ever met. Marcus argued the marital assets shouldn't be touched by unrelated business matters, as if the apartment and the trips hadn't come directly out of the household I'd maintained for over a decade without a dollar of income to my name. The judge, who by then also knew Marcus had been formally charged, did not find that argument compelling. In the settlement, because of the documented fraud, because Priya fought for every dollar, I received far more than Marcus ever thought I was capable of taking from him, not because the law is always kind to women like me, but because I had finally, for the first time in 11 years, stopped being quiet. 8 months after filing, Marcus showed up unannounced at my apartment, still in a suit, though he no longer had a job that required one. Vanessa had left, his mother wouldn't answer, everything had collapsed. And didn't that mean something? Didn't I owe him a conversation after 11 years? I looked at a man I'd once organized my entire existence around and felt almost nothing at all. You told a stranger to call you if I died, I said. I don't owe you anything. I gave you 11 years of conversations you never once really listened to. I closed the door. I didn't cry. I made dinner instead, and it was the first meal in years that tasted like something other than obligation. The first night I slept in my new house, boxes still stacked against the walls, nothing in the living room but a lamp and a mattress on the floor. I lay there in the dark, and instead of the old familiar tightness in my chest, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Quiet. Not the anxious, careful quiet of a woman listening for footsteps and moods before she dares speak. Just quiet. Mine. I cried that night. But it wasn't the kind I'd done for years in bathrooms and kitchen sinks. It was the kind that comes after you've been holding your breath a very long time and finally remember how to exhale. I bought that small house 6 months after the divorce finalized, with a garden I planted myself and a kitchen I cook in, only for people who deserve my table. I finished the degree Marcus once convinced me wasn't worth pursuing. I started my own consulting business, helping small firms untangle exactly the kind of project chaos I was once offered a promotion to fix and never got to try. My first client was a tiny landscaping company run by 2 brothers who barely trusted spreadsheets, let alone a woman walking in to reorganize their scheduling. I remember driving home after that meeting, laughing out loud at nothing in particular, simply because I could. Within a year I had 6 regular clients. Within 2 I had to hire help, and the day I signed that first employment contract at my own kitchen table, under my own name on the letterhead, I thought about the 15% raise Marcus once told me wasn't worth pursuing, and let myself feel the particular satisfaction of proving an old ghost wrong. The first time a client called me smart, capable, worth listening to, I let myself believe it, fully, for the first time since I was 26. I reconnected with an old friend, Sophia, lost almost a decade earlier, because Marcus always had a reason our evenings weren't a good idea. We met for coffee, nervous on both sides, and within 20 minutes we were laughing the way we used to in our 20s, as though no time had passed at all, as though the space between us had simply been waiting for me to find my way back to it. She told me, gently, that she'd tried reaching out for years, and I'd always seemed too busy, too distracted, too far away even when we were in the same room. I hadn't remembered it that way. I remembered only the vague, constant guilt Marcus had cultivated in me whenever I spent time on anything that wasn't him. Hearing it from her side was its own quiet grief, proof of how much of my life had been rerouted without my full awareness. We're close again now, the way we were before, and I've rebuilt other friendships since, slowly, the way you'd tend a garden gone untouched for years. Some of the soil had to be turned over more than once before anything grew back, but it did grow back, and that, more than the settlement, more than watching Marcus lose the career he'd built his whole identity around, has been the truest measure of everything I got back that he tried to take. Daniel and I stayed in touch. I won't call it a fairy tale, but what grew between us over 2 years was slow, careful, and entirely different from anything I'd known. He never once needed me smaller so he could feel bigger. When I told him nervously, that I was scared to trust anyone fully again. He simply said, "Then we'll go slow. There's no deadline on this." That sentence told me more about real love than 11 years of marriage ever had. I think about that night on the overpass more than I probably should. I think about how close I came to letting Marcus's 6 words disappear into the noise of a marriage I'd already convinced myself was ordinary. I think about how many of you watching are somewhere in the middle of your own version of that highway, telling yourself the tightness in your chest is just stress, still mistaking control for love, because no one ever showed you the difference. If that's you, hear this clearly. You are not too sensitive, not too dramatic, not asking for too much when you ask to be chosen fully. The humiliation you're carrying is not proof of your worthlessness. It is evidence of what someone else did to you, and evidence can be examined, understood, and put down. I think a lot about the word overreacting, because Marcus used it on me more times than I can count, and it's one of the quietest, most effective tools a controlling person uses against someone they claim to love. It doesn't sound cruel. It sounds concerned, but it teaches you to distrust the exact instincts that exist to keep you safe. It took a stranger's unremarkable kindness to remind me mine had been right the entire time. Justice doesn't always look like a courtroom. Sometimes it looks like a stranger on a rainy overpass who simply chooses to stay when everyone else has already left. Sometimes it looks like a woman discovering, at 37, broken and stitched and finally awake, that she was never the problem in her own story. I still drive over that overpass sometimes, on my way to see Sophia or meet a client across town, and it no longer feels like the site of the worst night of my life. It feels, oddly, like the place my life actually started, the exact point on the map where an old version of me stopped breathing quietly into a marriage that was slowly suffocating her, and a new version, bruised and finally furious in all the right ways, began to take her place. I've never told Daniel this directly, but I think he understands anyway, because he was there for the exact second the 2 versions of me traded places, holding his jacket against my head in the rain, waiting with a stranger's steady patience for me to become the woman I am now. I don't hate Marcus anymore. Hatred would mean he still occupies space in my life rent-free, and he's paid enough rent already. What I feel now is distance, the particular piece of a woman who finally, fully closed a door and didn't look back to see if it was still open. If this story reached the part of you that's been quietly hurting, subscribe to this channel, and tell me your name and the city you're watching from in the comments below. I read every single one. Like this video if you believe leaving is not the failure, staying when you shouldn't have is not a life sentence, and every person deserves to be chosen fully, not conditionally. And if you want to hear what happened when Marcus tried, months later, to show up uninvited at my new front door, asking for a second chance he had no right to ask for, stay close, because that story is coming next, and it ends exactly the way you're hoping it does. Thank you for staying with me through this one. I'll see you in the next story.